The air in the house always felt colder at night, as if the walls absorbed the silence and exhaled it back in icy whispers. Daniel, my husband, had fallen asleep early again, his back turned to me, his breathing heavy and even. I watched him for a moment, a man I once adored, now a stranger wrapped in familiar sheets. Our conversations had dwindled into routine exchanges, grocery lists, dry reminders, and the occasional forced laughter over dinner. The space between us felt insurmountable, a silent chasm neither of us acknowledged, but both felt. I sighed and slipped out of bed, reaching for the silk robe draped over the chair. The master bedroom's floorboards creaked under my weight, betraying my movement. Carefully, I pulled open the door and stepped into the hallway, the dim glow from the nightlight casting elongated shadows along the walls. Ryan, Daniel's son from his first marriage, had been living with us for the past few months. At 22, he was independent, yet carried an unspoken loneliness that mirrored my own. There was something about the way he moved, calm, measured, observant. Unlike his father, who had grown indifferent over the years, Ryan noticed things. He paid attention. Our interactions had always been polite but distant, though lately an undercurrent had begun to form, an awareness that neither of us acknowledged. A glance held too long, the accidental brush of hands when reaching for the same dish. A hesitancy in our conversations, as if we were both standing at the edge of something we shouldn't name. Tonight, I needed space. I entered the guest bathroom adjacent to Ryan's room, letting the robe slip from my shoulders as I reached for the hem of my shirt. The mirror reflected a version of myself I barely recognized, a woman caught between devotion and desire, obligation and longing. Then the door creaked. I turned sharply, heart slamming against my ribs. Ryan stood in the doorway. For a second, neither of us moved. His breath hitched, his eyes widening before they flickered downward, just for a moment, then back up, locking onto mine. A split second stretched into eternity. The shock on his face was evident, but something else lurked beneath it, something unspoken, something neither of us should entertain. Heat rushed to my face as I scrambled for the robe, yanking it over my shoulders. Ryan, I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. I didn't know you were in here. His voice was strained, hoarse. He hesitated, fingers tightening around the doorframe as if grounding himself. My pulse roared in my ears. This was an accident, a mistake. Yet, my body betrayed me. Every nerve alive, every breath uneven. It's fine, I murmured, though it wasn't. Nothing about this was fine. He should have left. I should have turned away. Instead, we lingered. The air between us grew heavy, charged with something dangerous. His gaze flickered, uncertain, hesitant but undeniably drawn. He was waiting for a sign, a reason to step back or step closer. And for one reckless, fleeting moment, I wasn't sure which I wanted him to choose. Then, as if waking from a spell, he exhaled sharply and stepped back, dragging a hand through his dark hair. "I'm sorry," he muttered, retreating into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, but the moment remained, lingering in the space between breaths. I stood frozen, the weight of what had just happened pressing against my chest. It was nothing. It should have been nothing. But as I caught my reflection once more, I saw the truth in my own eyes. This was something, and it had already begun, asterisk. I avoided Ryan for days. It was the only logical thing to do. I buried myself in routine, morning coffee with Daniel, errands that didn't need running, rooms that didn't need cleaning. I convinced myself that if I pretended nothing had happened, then maybe, just maybe, it would fade into the shadows, a fleeting misstep erased by time. But time didn't erase anything. The tension lingered, thick and unspoken. When we crossed paths in the kitchen or the hallway, it was there, coiled in the silence, crackling beneath every unsaid word. I felt his presence before I saw him, his movements careful, as if afraid to push too hard, to break whatever fragile barrier we had left. Then one evening, that barrier shattered. It was late. Daniel had already retreated to bed, exhausted from another long day at work. I stood in the dimly lit kitchen, stirring my tea, when I sensed him behind me. "Hey." Ryan's voice was quiet, hesitant. I turned slowly, my fingers tightening around the mug. "Hey," I replied, my tone too soft, too uncertain. He hovered near the counter, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. The space between us felt charged, a silent current pulling at the edges of restraint. His gaze flickered down to my hands, up to my lips, then back to my eyes. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I wanted to say sorry. About the other night." I swallowed. "It was an accident." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Was it?" The question settled between us, heavier than it should have been. My stomach tightened. There was no right answer. He stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him. My pulse quickened, but I didn't move. "I don't want things to be weird between us," he murmured. "Too late for that." I forced a smile, willing my voice to steady. "Neither do I." His gaze searched mine, as if looking for something: permission, denial, a reason to leave, or a reason to stay. My breath hitched when his fingers brushed against mine. Barely a touch, but deliberate. The mug in my hand trembled slightly. I should have pulled away. Instead, I stayed still. His hand lingered, his fingertips grazing over my knuckles before retreating. The absence of touch sent a shiver up my spine. "Good night, Elena," he said, voice lower now, rougher. I watched him go, heart hammering against my ribs. This was a mistake. It should have ended here, asterisk, asterisk. But it didn't. Hashtag, 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 the next step. The next night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. His hesitation, his lingering touch, the unspoken question in his gaze. I tossed and turned, but rest wouldn't come. I got up, padding quietly into the dimly lit hallway. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the living room. And then I saw him. Ryan stood at the far end of the hallway, leaning against his doorframe, as if he had been waiting for something. For me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The space between us felt alive, thrumming with everything we refused to say. I should have turned around, walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I took a step forward. So did he. Another step, then another, until we were inches apart, breath mingling in the quiet of the night. "Elena," he whispered, my name barely a breath on his lips. I closed my eyes, the war inside me raging louder than ever. This was wrong. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But when his hand reached for mine, his fingers lacing through my own, I didn't pull away. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The moment his fingers intertwined with mine, the world tilted. Everything rational, everything moral, everything I had built my life upon trembled beneath the weight of this single touch. Ryan didn't move. Neither did I. We simply stood there, locked in a silence too fragile to break. Then I exhaled, a slow, shuddering breath. "We shouldn't," I whispered. Ryan's grip tightened, his warmth seeping into my skin. "I know." And yet, neither of us stepped back. The air between us pulsed with the gravity of our choices. If I walked away now, I could pretend this was nothing, a fleeting impulse, a foolish moment of weakness. But if I stayed, if I allowed this tether between us to strengthen, there would be no undoing it. Ryan's other hand lifted, hesitating for only a second before tracing the inside of my wrist. His touch was deliberate, but not demanding. He was giving me an out, a chance to stop this before it began. But I didn't stop him. I let him pull me closer, let my breath hitch as his fingers skimmed along my arm. A slow, unbearable tension built between us, our bodies just shy of contact. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the sharp inhale of his breath as he studied me, waiting, searching, daring. I should have walked away. But then he whispered my name, and I was lost. The first touch was barely a touch at all, his lips grazing the corner of my mouth, pausing, letting me decide if I wanted more. I did. My hands moved on their own, gripping the fabric of his hoodie as I closed the gap. The kiss was slow, tentative, as if we were testing the limits of our recklessness. But the hesitation didn't last. A quiet gasp, a shift. Then, suddenly the restraint snapped. His hands slid to my waist, fingers pressing into the silk of my nightgown. My back met the hallway wall, his body caging mine in a way that should have felt wrong but didn't. Every nerve in my body ignited, every inch of my skin acutely aware of the way he fit against me. This was madness, a wildfire we couldn't contain, but I didn't care. His lips left mine, trailing along my jaw, down the curve of my neck. My breath hitched, nails digging into his shoulders as I fought against the tidal wave of guilt crashing against desire. Somewhere in the depths of my mind, a warning flickered. This is wrong. And yet, I tilted my head, granting him more. A sound shattered the moment. Footsteps. I pushed Ryan away, so fast he stumbled. My chest heaved as I turned toward the end of the hallway, heart pounding against my ribs. The bedroom door creaked open. Daniel, sleep-heavy and unaware, he mumbled something unintelligible before stepping toward the bathroom. I held my breath, every muscle rigid as he passed within feet of us, never once looking up. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, I exhaled, my pulse thundering in my ears. Ryan was watching me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "We should stop," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. Ryan's jaw clenched. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me otherwise. But the way his eyes burned into mine told me everything. This wasn't over. Not yet. And that terrified me more than anything.